Hey, Miguel Iturrate back here at the Cage Rage Podcast, and I'm joined by Anthony Scott Piatt over in Indiana. Chad taking this one off, but we know the man upstairs there is doing the right things behind the scenes. So we're going to carry the flag here with a little bit of a boxing history podcast, one of my favorite subjects, one of Chad's favorite subjects. But we're going to bring Anthony on. Anthony, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great, man. I'm so glad you turned me on to these fights. Stanley Ketchel and Billy Papke. What a great story. And I'm looking forward to talking about not just the fights, but a little bit of the stuff surrounding old Stanley Ketchel.
Yep, that's what we're going to... The bottom line is we did corroborate already on a couple of podcasts, and we looked at historic fights. We looked at HBO's history. And in there, we started talking about trilogies. And we unearthed this fight series from like 1908, 1909, just to really go old school and to talk about something that a lot of people didn't know about. I know, Scott, do I call you Scott or do I call you Anthony? What do you like better here?
I like it all, man. Whatever flows off your tongue.
Anthony Scott Piatt is ASP, so I like call you ASP.
That's right.
But anyway,
like Cleopatra.
So, you're the... but, so the bottom line is I know you're a researcher, though. And I know that when I gave you the names, you went back and looked at it. So I'm going to ask you to take the lead, man, and just guide me through this because these are fun fights for me.
These are great fights. And unfortunately, fortunately, let's be thankful for what we have. There's actual footage of their fourth fight. The first three fights, there's not footage of. But they fought 20 rounds back then. They had a 12th round ended and an 11th round ended. So that means they fought 2 to 20, 20, 30, 40, 62 rounds, 63 rounds these guys fought. In 13 months, they fought 63 rounds. They started in June of 1908. They fought 3 months later. They fought at the end of 1908. And then the one that we have on tape is July 5th, 1909. That's their fourth fight. In 13 months. Both men only 23 years old when they stepped into the ring in 1909. Hell of a fight. And if you, a little bit of the background on Ketchel, he's a runaway, he's a hobo. He gets in a fight at a cat house with a bouncer, and he knocks the guy out. And that's the start of his career, is knocking a bouncer out. Oh, I can fight. I can knock people out. So then, just in no time later, he becomes a boxer, and he's one of the greats. So it's a fascinating story. Champagne bubble baths and stuff later on that we can get into that you know a little bit about as well. But these fights are amazing. And the fight that they do have on tape is something else. I mean, he debuts. Papke comes out in 1905, and he has 38 pro fights. He only loses twice, and both of them are to Ketchel. So that's how good Ketchel is. Papke only lost to Ketchel in his whole career.
Yeah, I mean, to put both guys in perspective for modern people, and I'm hoping that this podcast is for people who don't know who these guys are, right? Because they're going to be people who know more than myself or Anthony, but we got to get the word out there because some of these stories are just too fascinating to let go, you know what I mean? And the Ketchel and Papke, they are both in the Hall of Fame. And despite all the warts of their personal lives and stuff, they're both in the Hall of Fame, so you're talking about Hall of Fame level fighters. A lot of people, we don't do this type of rating much anymore, not officially anyway, but a lot of people had both of them in their top 10 middleweights of all time. Ketchel pretty much near the top. You can still find Ketchel near the top with some of the hardcore people because his reputation was all that. He fought for the heavyweight title, he was dead at 26, so just a situation there where what you have there is an unfinished story, and that adds to the lore of Stanley Ketchel,
Yeah, you bring that up, going into this fourth fight, it was understood that if Ketchel was to beat Papke in the fourth fight, that he would fight Jack Johnson. That's the heavyweight. He's given up 30 to 50 pounds in that fight. And just a recap on this fourth and final fight where if he wins, he gets to face Johnson. In round 13, the fight's pretty well even. And in round 17, they're still swinging like mad and wild. I mean, they've got energy to spare. In round 20, they're both still swinging. Ketchel does win it by decision. That sets him up to go fight Jack Johnson. Now, interestingly enough, Ketchel does knock Jack Johnson down, but it's in the 12th. Johnson gets up and merely seconds later hits Ketchel so hard, Ketchel's out, and Jack Johnson's pulling 2 of Ketchel's teeth out of his glove at the ring. So it lends some credence to a theory, which the theory was that they had agreed to kind of carry this fight 10 rounds to give a show, and that since it was after the 10th round, that Ketchel then took his shot to try and knock out Jack Johnson. All it did was, sort of wake the beast a little bit. So it seems to be pretty likely that that happened. But what do you know about that in particular, or in that era? How much of this stuff would have been a dog and pony show,
Yeah, well, I think the dog and pony show implies a pro wrestling aspect to it. And I don't think that you had that level of, hey, we're putting on a show, let's make sure we don't get hurt kind of thing.
Right, yeah, I didn't mean it that way, yeah.
Certain gentlemen's agreements, especially with real pros like this, there may be a situation there, where there were agreements that came up. And I think that there's a lot of lore from this era. So let's go back and look at Billy Papke and Stanley Ketchel 1. Because this is the fight that starts it all off. You know what I mean? And in and of itself, that makes it important. And
Minnesota, where was that one at, Miguel?
That
Minnesota.
happened in Milwaukee.
Milwaukee,
Wisconsin. And now what you're dealing with is you're dealing with June of 1908. And Ketchel's already the world champion, and he's already on a run. And Papke's undefeated. Still, now here, he's fighting in his area, because Papke's originally out of the Chicago area. So he's fighting at home. Eventually, Papke lists his employment as a miner, and they meet 3 times in California around the mines and stuff. And as you mentioned, for the 4th video, for their 4th fight where there's video, you can see Billy Papke, the effects of the type of work he did with the tan lines and stuff, because you ain't seen tan lines like this, because this boy must have been in the sun.
They have,
desert and stuff. It borderlines on absurd looking, but it also, when you look at it with a sober mind, it also hints at a really, really tough life. You know what I mean? The dude was hard. So, Papke's the guy getting his shot, and you can't do it in Chicago because Chicago's got all kinds of rules, right? But Milwaukee, in this time, is one of the hotbeds of boxing. So, where's the boxing good? You got guys, for example, one of our favorites, and we've got a podcast on him, is Ad Wolgast, the lightweight champion. He fought in Michigan, didn't make a name for himself until he moved to Milwaukee and set himself up there, where from Milwaukee got other opportunities out west and in New York and stuff like that. But you had to impress people in Milwaukee. Milwaukee was that place. So now, Milwaukee is bringing in the world champion, Stanley Ketchel, and they're bringing their local guy, Billy Papke, up for his fight. 1,500 people supposedly saw it, including a lot of boxing royalty. Ad Wolgast was there. There were many other champions from the era that were in that fight. This fight is talked about as one of the roughest fights from that era, and it's also because it was widely attended. Interesting note, on the wrestling end, because you had the start of the division of striking and wrestling and showmanship and things like that, but there's a legendary wrestler named Frank Gotch, who is the grandfather of professional wrestling, basically, and considered one of the toughest of all time. Frank Gotch was at this fight in Milwaukee. So he was involved in, Gotch was in the conversation who's the toughest man in the world at that time. Not the best boxer, because he wasn't. But if you broke it down to other things, Gotch was there, and Gotch did have a boxing match or two here under different names and things. Very different era, but you had there a conglomeration of people that made this a legendary fight, and people look back at the fight. So now, you want to talk about lore, there's a story that says that there was a sucker punch that came in the very early going on one of these fights, right?
The second fight is the one that you're speaking of, and I want to correct myself from earlier. I thought the first one was 20 rounds. It was actually a 10-round fight. So they actually fought 20, 30, 53 rounds in the 13 months. A 10-round on the first fight. But the incident that you're speaking to was in the the 12-round loss. It's the one that Ketchel lost. It was the second fight. They come up and they're going to shake hands, and Papke tags him. It's a gray area. Was it legal or not? Probably not.
There are credible sources on the internet that said that that's discounted because it hasn't appeared in newspapers and in the sources from that era. They haven't been able to corroborate it to a certain level yet, right? So we don't know for sure. But this goes
on to say that Ketchel then was so upset about it because he never really got back in the fight, 12-round loss, that he called, apparently, did Babe Ruth really call the home run? We're not sure about that either. But apparently Ketchel called that he was going to beat him up for 10 rounds and knock him out in the 11th in the third fight, and that's what he did. So whether he called it or not, but that's the reports.
And, you know, I mean, Ketchel was a bold guy. Ketchel had world domination, and like you mentioned, you know, he was a guy who at the time blew $2,000 filling up a bathtub with champagne in celebration of a win. He was known for carrying his pearl-handled revolvers around with him. So this was, you know, we're talking about really the Wild West was still the Wild West, right?
Yeah.
And so Ketchel is not a Milwaukee native, a Michigan native, but because he hoboed as a youth, he's identified as being from Idaho or Montana, like the real wild north. And, you know, that there was definitely fighting scenes there, including a small town that went bankrupt, bringing a Jack Dempsey fight there many years later and stuff like that. So because there was mining and money and things like that around, men of money always looked, you know, for entertainment and fights, and that's what it became.
I drove by that town, Miguel, just to interject real quick. I drove by that very town that bankrupted themselves. I believe it's the same one that Teddy Roosevelt visited. It was a booming town for a really short amount of time, and I think it was in Kansas. I'm not, if I remember right, if we're talking about the same town. But it boomed. 11 months later, the thing is gone. It's a ghost town, and it's still a ghost town now. But yeah, very interesting stuff.
I don't want to get it wrong, so I'll just fill you in. But I'm pretty sure. Hold on a minute here.
Well, that brings us to the fact that he died out on a ranch as well. I mean, we've got to fit that in before we wrap this up, Miguel. You know, in 1910, he's only 24. He's 23 during these great trilogy or quadrilogy fights. So in 1909, he's 23. He's fighting Papke for the fourth time. In 1910, he's only 24 years old. He's still the champ. He gets shot and killed. And you tell it great. He's having breakfast, right?
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is the reports of those days, the newspapers of those days, they work in innuendo, you know, as opposed to now where we're much more direct. So the lore says that he was shot by the husband of the woman who was making him breakfast, implying that, you know, they had spent the night together and stuff. There's more of a story there, and there's more details there. But we segue into a bunch of different things. It's Shelby, Montana is the town we're talking about. And Tommy Gibbons bankrupted with their fight many years later. So at any rate, that's 10 years down after this. But Montana, Idaho, that rough area of the country, which is still very sparsely populated, that's where Stanley Ketchel grew up, fighting at train stops and things like that. Yes. And that's where you get, the Michigan assassin kind of thing. He became a big star. So what happens is, like I said, men of money like to draw fights. And Milwaukee has an interesting man of money, and I think he's worth a character that may be worthy more than in boxing. And that's a guy named Frank Mulkern. Mulkern was the sponsor of the fight. And so, you know, he paid for Stanley Ketchel to come in, and he paid, Billy Papke made the fight, and he was an active promoter with one of the boxing clubs in Milwaukee. So, and there were a few of them. So these guys were in competition with each other. Now, Mulkern is a guy who's interesting because I believe one of the ways that he started to make a fortune for himself was he acquired 30 vehicles and made a rental car agency that became like Hertz Rent-A-Car or something along those lines.
Yeah.
So Mulkern was a wealthy guy from the beginning. There are also stories of Mulkern crashing a car in the desert where they used to take him like to Arizona to race. Like, you know, we race these cars would go about 70 miles an hour, 60, you know, so it's not extreme by our measure, but for them, it was certainly extreme because they'd never gotten a car up that fast before. So they'd be like, hey, can they get it to go 120 miles? So they'd be 120-mile races, and there's a report of a car accident where the opponents died in the car crash. So Mulker was involved in what I would call elite stuff, you know, sponsoring fights. He was a wealthy guy. He did later turn to managing and was responsible for moving Ad Walgas into position in the West Coast. Turned over his contract to another person for Walgas to better his career. But Mulkern is an interesting story. Mulkern's the guy that, after all, wanted to make the best fights, and this Papke Ketchel fight turned into a bloodletting, and that's the kind of
great fight. Yeah.
To sum it up really fast, I think what happened here is Ketchel has a reputation, and if you look at it, just looking back, he's got like 49 recorded official wins, and 46 are by knockout. Now, that's a percentage and a number that transcends time. You know what I mean? That's higher than GGG, and that's all people could talk about GGG a couple of weeks ago, you know, a couple of years back, you know, his knockout percentage. Ketchel maintained that at an early point at a high level, and that means a great deal, right? So Ketchel's an all-time guy coming to Milwaukee to face probably the promoter's guy, right? The guy that the promoter wanted to it would be great as a promoter. It would be great if the next world championship contender and world champion came from your stable, right?
Right there. Yeah.
I think lure Ketchel in, and what happened with this is I think it becomes Papke had his number, and not in such a way that he beat him because he only won one of the fights, but Ketchel had to work like against very few others here. And the fact is, he didn't get the knockout this first fight. And most of the newspaper reports that I've read describe Papke practically laughing at Ketchel, smiling at him when he would take a shot and stuff like that. So I think that, you know, the word that it was a bloody fight and the word that it was a really hard-fought fight, combined with some of those mental aspects that you still get where Papke was going to lose the fight. Even maybe in front of his own home crowd, even maybe with the promoter on his side, he lost the fight. But the guy couldn't beat him. You know, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but 49 wins, 46 knockouts, and he lost to Papke once, didn't knock him out in the first fight. So most of those guys he didn't knock out was Billy Papke. So
right.
Papke was,
and that's the same with Papke. The only guy in 38 pro fights, he only lost to Ketchel. The same with Papke. I mean, they damaged each other and beat everybody else, essentially.
And that's what these became. These were known as wars of attrition. So Ketchel has a tough fight the first time out, and there's a push for a rematch. And again, Mulkern probably playing a role. Papke goes out west and gets a rematch. And it's here where the rumor is that he sucker punched Ketchel before the bell.
Yep.
The bottom line is that the reports I've read do say that in the first few minutes of the fight, in the early going, Ketchel got hurt.
Yeah.
And he hung on, but he was not himself. And whether that happened with a cheap move by Papke before the bell, or right at the bell, or right in the ensuing beginnings of the fight, that's kind of lost to time, but that's where the story starts.
You know, maybe it's a Floyd Mayweather situation where he, Victor Ortiz, you know, it was a dirty shot. Maybe a legal shot, perhaps, but it was dirty. You know, I mean, whether it was fair or not, it's great enough area. Yeah.
And you could surmise something like that because you do have the idea, the story is that it was a cheap shot before the bell, and then a very strong set of circumstances and evidence show that that's been discounted, right? So you don't know there, but you can't say Papke broke through early and got the win in this fight.
Yeah, maybe it was after the bell. Maybe it was after the bell. It was legal, but it was thrown. You know, he starts throwing the punch, then ding, ding, and then he gets hit. I mean, he didn't hit him until the bell rang. Maybe it wasn't dirty. Maybe it was. We're not going to know on this one. I want to mention something, though, that I'm just laughing in my head at. You were saying he's the Michigan assassin from Idaho, but he fights out of Milwaukee. I'm thinking of Top Gun 2.5 or whatever. Not Top Gun. The Leslie Nielsen deals.
Okay.
You know, kind of like the airplane movies or whatever.
Sure.
But those are great, funny movies. I can't believe I can't think of the title of it, but I can clearly see the scene. It's the Michigan assassin out of here, fights out of here. No, that's the Cincinnati Kid. He's from Brooklyn. He fights in Texas.
Yeah, but in 1900s, you had a regional sport. And it meant something if you'd won in Philadelphia. It meant something if you'd gone to New York and made it in front of New York. The boxing writers became very powerful, and there's actually one of them whose initials are TAD today. I won't remember his full name for this one, but Tad was it because he wrote for the San Francisco Chronicle, and then later on in many years moved to New York. So he was literally at the two apexes of the sport, and was the only guy, because it's not like, well, we watched the fights on TV. No, this was the guy who could say, I saw him live, and everybody in the country he'd seen, you know? So he's one reference to him comes from Jack Dempsey himself, who says no one knows more boxing than Tad, T-A-D. So look that up. Tadeus Aloysius, the name won't come to me right now. I didn't have it in my notes. I had
to look up the name I was forgetting, because how bad would I be if I can't research a little bit, right? That's what I do. The Naked Gun 2.5. That's where you can find the wonderful boxing. It's sort of a who's on first, Abbott and Costello thing that they do. They play and ref up of, and it's wonderful.
The only, I'm not a huge fan of that type of slapstick movie. The only line in any Leslie Nielsen movie that I can appreciate is, "Nice beaver."
With a tip of the hat. I'm done. For the fun wage range, I'm going to say we wrap it up on that, because it's not going to get any better, and if it gets any worse, we're going to make the air.
but wait, we got Papke just becoming a world champion, and then Stanley Ketchel, because he's the champion and the revered champion, forces a rematch and wins the belt again, and then they fight a fourth time where they go to 20 rounds, and Papke, kind of gets his respect. But Papke spent 2 months as world champion. Ketchel is the big name there, but Papke becomes a story in every one of those fights. Papke won by knockout in the 12th because perhaps a dirty shot, perhaps he broke through early, and Ketchel made it to the 12th round. He'd been up and down and hurt throughout the fight. Then the next fight, less than 2 months later, Ketchel gets his revenge, or less than 3 months later, rather, Ketchel gets his revenge. Rumor has it he calls the knockout to be in the 11th round, and then they fight again a little bit later in 1909 on July 4th, July 5th, that weekend, which at the time means, that's pay-per-view, that's Cinco de Mayo. That was where everybody's attention was on the boxing world. So the Papke Ketchel fights, both guys ended in tragedy too. I think we should mention Billy Papke's tragedy, because Papke had a son, his son boxed, and at some point he was living in California, and the rumor is, he was going through a divorce. His wife asked him for a divorce. He did not handle that well, and on Thanksgiving evening, he was drinking at his friend's bar and saying, well, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? His friend said, go home and sleep it off, and he went home and killed his wife and killed himself. So, boxing as a way of, you'll see these tragedies add up as we go through these boxing history podcasts.
Arturo Gatti, which is another great trilogy that we talked about, Mickey Ward and Arturo Gatti, and then Gatti going out in a very shady way.
There's one that might even still be an open case somewhere.
Yeah, it should be. It should be.
So we've got Billy Papke and Stanley Ketchel, both Hall of Famers. Both guys were starting to fade into history. Ketchel, not as much as Papke, but thankfully with video and stuff. Now you got some homework to do if you're a fan of the CRP Boxing History Podcast, because these are fights. All the reading I've done from the era, I've got magazines that covered some of the fights and things like that. They jump out at you. They do.
Absolutely. These are great, Miguel. I love doing these history ones with you. I mean, those of you that know me from Wage Rage, that's sort of my home zone, if you will. But these are great. I love you sending me, hey, check this out, hey, check that out, and getting my knowledge a little deeper on these 1908, 1909 fights. And this is the foundation. This is where a lot of this started. Let's face it. I mean, we can go back to the English style, but for American boxing, this is our history. This is Milwaukee. This is out west. This is the real stuff. These are the Hall of Famers. So I really appreciate you turning me on a little bit more to these, Miguel.
Yeah, and like I said, anybody, there are people who know more about it out there. Share the information. Boxing has a way of sometimes, insulating itself and stuff. And I think that these are stories that really transcend time. These are real, history. And if you look at it, it makes boxing really the richest history that we have for any sport, baseball, football, basketball included. So I enjoy doing them. We didn't get much into the details of the fights and read some of that stuff, but we'll leave that up to you guys, and we'll leave it there. Stanley Ketchel, Billy Papke, a quartet of fights for the ages here at the CRP.